Good morning, everybody. So I do want to finish the chapter 4 lecture today um, on reason, heuristics, and so on, but I do want to first go over the study guide. So basically, the best way to study for exams in this class would be to go through and define each of these. They're kind of split up by chapter, and you can find them both in the book and the lectures. So again, find the definitions for these terms, these concepts, know the basics of some of these studies if they're mentioned, like the Samaritan study. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about individual and independent, collectivist, interdependent cultures, so be familiar with those, the culture of honor study. Chapter 2, the different research methods, statistical analysis. Again, not a whole lot other than just definitions here. Then getting into chapter 3, looking at the social self. Moving into chapter 4, talking about reasoning, heuristics, how we interpret the world, essentially. And the application module, just a couple of questions that may show up from the application module, and then just a couple of questions will probably show up from the righteous mind. Again, these are not, as you can see here, not a lot are coming from there. Most of the questions will come from the first 4 chapters of the exam. Okay, so, and I will be available tomorrow and hopefully sometimes in the rest of it. Okay. So I ended last time by talking about how, if you're a pitcher, a baseball pitcher, there are a number of things that you can do, or any sports player, even if you don't know, the mathematics behind it. So, the pitchers probably don't necessarily know the physics of what they're doing, but they know how to do it. It's just sort of ingrained, it's innate, sort of, and that's what we see here, is this innate ability, and that's really what I'm going to be focusing on. So we have these 2 systems. We have a intuitive system, and that's the one that is basically, essentially, almost automatic. You process things at the same time. We have the intuitive system that is processing. The best research on this comes from Daniel Kahneman and his not accomplice, his co-author, co-researcher, Eamon Tversky, who died a number of years ago. Students used to ask me what book, if I could, suggest any book to read before you graduate. I used to say Thinking Fast and Slow. I think I still would think that, because it does help you understand just your own mind. Just a number of great quotes. Nothing in life is as important as you think it is while you are thinking about it. So there are these 2 systems. Again, I talked about the intuition. This is system 1, perception. It's fast. It's almost automatic. It's, you don't really put in much effort. Then the system 2 is rational and reasoning. This you essentially have to put a lot of effort into reasoning, trying to determine what it is that you're going to, how you're going to respond to the situation, and that sort of thing. And there are different ways. You can go very slowly. You can do sort of the same thing. You try to control and, be mindful of what you're doing. Develop certain rules for yourself, maybe. And also, probably, you have to make yourself a little bit flexible. So the rational system is slower, it's more controlled. You have to kind of, that's where you think about logic and so on. Heuristics, this is an important concept. This is basically rules of thumb. These are the ways in which we can quickly think about things and quickly process information. And, the better we get at, I think, developing our own minds and, being aware of our own thought, enriching our cognitive abilities, I think makes for better heuristics. So, which of these would you rather pick? The small bowl has 10% odds, the large bowl has 9% odds. Well, even though you have better odds with a small bowl, most people would still go for the larger bowl because they see a larger number of pink balls. again, here, this is a good example of it too. You've probably seen this in statistics classes, but if you are flipping a quarter and you flip five, heads, oftentimes our minds think, well, the next one should be tails, right? Because it seems like it's just likely. It seems like you've had this run for a long time of heads, and it's about time we should get a tails. But it's all random, and so it's, it could be tails or it could be another heads. We're not very good at probabilistic thinking, and I'm actually someone who thinks that we should focus more on statistics in high school and less on algebra. I think we use statistics actually more than, well, I know we use statistics way more than we use most algebra. And again, as I said, it depends on what your experiences are. The availability heuristic, the process whereby you are making judgments about frequency and the probability of some event based upon some, how readily these things come to mind. So, this guy here says 12 die in a plane crash. He says, I'll never fly again, but doesn't say how many flew and didn't die. I used to go surfing and live in California for a while. And, I never saw a shark. I did have a student who was bitten and died from a shark attack. But there have been very few. There have been under 20 shark attacks, fatal shark attacks on the West Coast in the last 100 years. So it's not actually a huge problem. But, if you, a generation or two were raised on the movie Jaws, this kind of horror flick about a shark attack, and I think really made people afraid of sharks, even though they are actually a keystone species. They're very important for marine life in general. Oops. We tend to be biased as well when we think about risk. I think we talked about crime rates at one point. I mean, this is, again, a great example. The news media tends to love covering crime. It's flashy, it's exciting in a kind of morbid way, and so on. But it has the effect then that it leads people to think that there's more crime than there actually is. It's the same thing with, you see the protests and police videos of police brutality and so on. There's far more peaceful protests than have been violent, but they haven't been covered as much as the violent ones. It's kind of like, there are a lot of police that are, as we know, that don't do a good job at their jobs. Nevertheless, there are a number of, police that are doing the best job they can. They're trying to be just and follow the law and follow the rules and be humane and so on and so forth. And again, they're not covered as much as perhaps, the police officer who is found to be a violent racist and so on. And maybe that's a good thing. But that's the world we tend to live in. When people were asked the different kinds of risk, I think it was kind of interesting. The smallpox vaccination was the most underestimated. Diabetes, which again makes sense, for some reason. I mean, well, American society, our food system is kind of based on sugar, and that's why we have such high diabetes levels in the United States. And all of these tend to be associated with greater risk of coronavirus, which is, again, very alarming. So availability as a close cousin, fluency. This is the feeling of ease you have with processing information. So depending on where you're from, perhaps you can process information faster or slower. Someone who, grew up in a rural area and then goes to New York City, it's going to be sort of overwhelming if they haven't really spent much time in the city. And so they're processing a lot of information, whereas someone who's perhaps grew up in Chicago and moves to New York City, it's not, it's perhaps not it's not as big of a change or shock. We see that, mood plays a big role, and I'll talk about that in a moment. If you kind of want to look at this, one way, that they have tried to do this is that, they use this hard kind of font here, and what they're trying to do then is to kind of mess with your thinking, make you focus a bit more, concentrate. And what they do then is that, they find that these questions are answered quickly. These ones are answered quite slowly because you're kind of having to reread it or read it for the first time, and so on. Another important heuristic is the representative heuristic. These judgments are based on how similar something is to the example, making judgments of social relationships, and so on. This is important for those of you who are going into law, criminal justice, and so on. We'll talk about stereotypes later, as I said, but a lot of this kind of plays into it. So, someone based upon how they look can, seem like more likely to be a criminal. A very old stereotype is that for some reason having eye problems make you seem more clever than if you don't. So when people see someone who's got a bunch of tattoos, who's been accused of some crime, and perhaps that's not how, they don't have friends with tattoos or anything like that. People can make these judgments that end up being quite inaccurate. Where do we get this information that we make judgments based upon? We have what's called base rate information. This is information about the frequency of events that are happening to members in different categories in a population. So if you know perhaps the percentage of white rural people in poverty, that would be a base rate information, and you can kind of go from there to try to develop programs or economic development and so on and so forth. Which is kind of interesting. So you can look at this actual study in the book. Some important concepts for those of you going into most professional careers these days, where you need to know some basic statistical know-how and so on. Basically, we call this regression effect when we have two variables that are not correlated for each other. So you have extreme values on one end, and they seem to be associated with less extreme values on the other. What we find is that there's an average point, and you can go back to chapter 2 to look at this more in detail. Basically, we see that there's a bell curve. We have what's called a bell curve, where most of the data points fall within certain degrees from the middle, from the average, however we decide to measure that. And the regression fallacy is the fact that we tend to see things head toward the average. We always tend to see some outliers, in terms of, say, height or IQ or whatever it might be. But the regression effect is the tendency to see these things head towards the middle. The regression fallacy is the failure to see the regression effect. So again, this is sort of statistical thinking, and it's fairly recent in human history that we've begun to think so probabilistically. So it's interesting where this will go, and I think there's a lot of potential for having a better understanding of the world, of ourselves and our planet, but there's also the potential for abuse. Other important heuristics, the planning fallacy. So this is the tendency for people to be unrealistically optimistic about projects. You probably have that. I know that I have this happen sometimes, where I have great plans for a class or for some paper or book, and it just doesn't happen. I did a lot of research on urban development, and one of the things that you see is a lot of planning fallacies in urban planning departments, city governments. So governments are notorious for starting projects, underestimating how long the project will take and the cost that will be incurred. So whenever you plan for the future, always remember that you might try to make it realistic, your planning, and try to plan well. Okay, I'm going to go past that. So again, the one area that's kind of important where we see the representative heuristic at work is with astrology. So astrology is, trying to understand human personalities based upon the astrological sign, which is based upon which is based upon the year and the month and so on and so forth. I think I am a Taurus. What we see is that we have these different characteristics, and it's hard to tell if these are. I'll just say that I don't take them very seriously. You can often find, if you were. So I'm a Taurus, but I could probably fit into some of these other ones as well, and we can mislead ourselves pretty easily. Nevertheless, you just see sort of an association there and think, well, I am kind of plotting. I don't know if I'm prone to rage so much, but whatever. So what we tend to find here is this illusory correlation where there's a correlation between variables, but they're not in fact related. So, ice cream consumption goes up in the summer, and so do murders. Does that mean that more ice cream consumption causes more murders? No, that's an illusory correlation. So studies that have been done, there's a famous couple of psychologists, the Chapmans, they did this study where they showed people Rorschach tests, these famous ink blot tests. And what they did is they were interested in projective personality tests, which is what Rorschach tests are, where basically the idea is that people are kind of projecting their personalities onto these images. So if they see a face here and mustache or something like that, that means something. So they did this study back in the 1960s, very classic study. This draw a person test is another version where they draw people. What they did in this one was they had a number of psychotic patients take some time to draw a person, and they found that the pictures were, they tried to understand those who, the psychology of the artist or the person who did the drawing, and tried to match them up. And what they found was that people who were suspicious of other people were just as likely to paint pictures with large eyes or small eyes as others, which is kind of interesting. And so then they took these pictures and they showed them to college students and asked them, can you tell, what does this make you think, and so on and so forth. So the students thought that drawing big eyes seemed to indicate mental illness. And it seems that, I'm not sure if it's the case, but if you do see eyes in here, I think there's maybe not mental illness, but it is an indication of thinking about people or thinking about others and so on. So anyway, kind of classic research on the Rorschach test there. Okay, so that is it for chapter 4. So the exam again will cover chapters 1 through 4, the terms on the study guide. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions, and I shall be around. So have a good week, everyone. Good luck with the studying.